The Pan American Exposition of 1901 is a celebration of America and the promise of a new century. Elaborately staged in Buffalo, New York, the fair is an entertaining showcase of culture and industry. The centerpiece is a 409-foot electric tower studded with 35,000 incandescent light bulbs. It proclaims a new age of progress. Even President McKinley is here to speak of a bright future to his rapt audience. Until tragedy strikes. The bewildered president has been struck by an assassin's bullet. He's rushed to the exposition's infirmary, where the doctors decide they must operate immediately. They scrub their hands and instruments, but as in the custom of the day, they wear no gloves, caps, or masks to help ward off infection. Ether is used to render the president unconscious. But ether is highly flammable, so the outdated gas lights must be turned off. At 5:29 p.m., the operation begins. As the daylight fades, a doctor uses a mirror to guide the last rays of sunlight into the darkening room. They hunt in vain for the bullet in McKinley's abdomen. After an hour and 20 minutes of cutting and probing, they close the wound. The bullet is never found. Outside, anxious crowds wait for any news of the operation. They are told the president is alive and being given raw eggs to sustain him, enemas to purge him, and injections of strychnine to stimulate his nerves. But 8 days later, William McKinley dies from gangrene, a bacterial infection caused by his wound. It is an ominous beginning for medicine in the 20th century. In 1900, the era of scientific medicine is only just beginning. There are few first-rate physicians, almost no medicines. If you become sick or injured, you'll need a strong constitution or plenty of luck to survive, even if you are President of the United States. It's been a few decades since the French scientist Louis Pasteur discovered the microscopic creatures we call bacteria and demonstrated that these germs could cause many illnesses. Later, researchers discover an even tinier infectious agent, the virus. But despite these discoveries, many people continue to blame sickness on a variety of human traits and social conditions. A poor constitution, a degenerate lifestyle, or miasmic clouds of filth emanating from the city slums. Though the scientific community knows that germs cause disease, they don't completely understand how they're spread. And they certainly don't know how to destroy them. In the early morning hours of June 27th, 1899, a ship sails into San Francisco Bay, ending a fateful voyage from Hong Kong. At the U.S. quarantine station on Angel Island, a delegation of health officials anxiously awaits the ship's arrival. passengers aboard may have died from the dreaded bubonic plague. If it's true, the ship cannot be allowed to reach the mainland. Angel Island is San Francisco's bastion of defense against infectious diseases. All immigrants must first pass through these hallways to be examined and disinfected. Anyone who shows signs of illness could be quarantined or sent back home. Lately, health inspectors have been especially worried that foreigners might bring in the plague, an ancient and deadly bacterial infection that rapidly overwhelms the body's defenses.
There was a great deal of fear and anticipation in San Francisco that the plague was coming to invade the West Coast. In fact, the plague had already begun in China 30 years earlier and had moved down the coast to cities like Canton and Hong Kong, with which we had a great deal of commercial traffic as well as immigration traffic.
There are hundreds of thousands of victims in China and India. Japan, the Philippines, and Hawaii have also been struck. When the plague breaks out in the Chinese quarter of Honolulu, panicked officials accidentally burn the neighborhood to the ground. 500 years after the plague wiped out a third of Europe in the Middle Ages, there is still no cure. And now the disease may have finally reached America. At Angel Island, the ship is quarantined by the U.S. government's top bacteriologist, Joseph Kenyon. Assuming that plague bacteria is spread person to person, Kenyon quarantines the mostly Asian passengers and crew. Like his colleagues, he also believes plague bacteria thrive in dirt and can be spread to human dwellings by vermin. So he orders the ship fumigated with steam and poisonous sulfuric sprays. As officers inspect the cargo, stowaways are suddenly discovered. 2 appear to have the plague. Fearing imprisonment, the ill stowaways escape during the night and try to swim to San Francisco. Early the next morning, their corpses are found floating in the harbor. When local officials announce that they do have the plague, the city feels more vulnerable than ever. On March 6, 1900, the Chinese Year of the Rat, the body of Chick Jin, a Chinese merchant, is found in the basement of a cheap hotel. An autopsy confirms everyone's worst fears. The plague has struck in Chinatown. Accusing the Chinese of being foul spreaders of disease, the city jumps into action. Policemen string a heavy rope around the 15 square blocks of Chinatown. To their surprise, Chinese San Franciscans discover they are now prisoners in their own homes. Guards are assigned to keep residents from spreading the disease to the white community. Armed with crowbars and disinfectants, posses systematically raid and fumigate every house, destroying the worst of the slums. Anyone who even looks sick is whisked away to Angel Island.
The Chinese response to what was happening was terror. What would they be subjected to? Where would they be put? Would a wall be placed around Chinatown? Would they all be expelled from the United States?
And when the posse of policemen with a few volunteers were coming into the various houses with crowbars and axes and started to tear down walls and doors, the hostility and the panic increased dramatically.
The Chinese smuggle their sick out of the city through a vast labyrinth of tunnels beneath Chinatown. Many escape on rafts floated out into the bay. As a result, no one knows how many plague victims there really are. But with fewer than 200 confirmed deaths, relieved authorities declare the quarantine a success. In time, the city begins to relax. Life returns to normal. The memory of the plague recedes with the years. Few realize that the city is more vulnerable than ever. In 1906, a devastating earthquake rocks San Francisco. Raging fires spread throughout the city. More than 1,000 people die. Rats, disoriented by the earthquake, swarm through the streets. And the plague strikes again. But this time, there is no talk of quarantining neighborhoods. Public health officials now target rats instead of people. Rats had always been associated with plague outbreaks, but now scientists understand their role in transmitting the disease. Researchers in India noticed that plague-ridden rats and human victims were both covered with flea bites. When they found plague bacteria in the saliva of fleas, the connection was made. Fleas were biting diseased rats and then transmitting the plague bacteria when they bit humans. The city bands together to wage a war on rats and fleas. Buildings are rat-proofed and fumigated. Garbage is collected and removed. Over 1 million rats are trapped and slaughtered. As a result, a disease that could have reached epidemic proportions is stopped in its tracks.
When the 1907 epidemic finally petered out, San Franciscans could look back and discover a few things. One is a better understanding of medicine, of scientific medicine, had led to the extermination of rats and a hunt for rats rather than people, as compared to 1900. But certainly, bacteriology was becoming increasingly important. Germ theory had led to a whole new scientific understanding of what makes people sick.
Epidemic diseases like typhoid and cholera begin to fade as cities start providing safe drinking water and better sewer systems. Counties bolster efforts to pick up garbage and spray for insects, reducing diseases like yellow fever. And educational campaigns teach mothers how to better feed and nurture their children. As a result, infant mortality begins to decline. And by the second decade of the century, life expectancy in Western countries starts to rise.
Now, public health tried to be proactive rather than reactive. They tried to prevent things from happening rather than reacting after they happened. This was also the progressive era in American history, and this was a time when the progressives were very interested in reforms of all kinds. They had a great faith in science. Science was the new religion. And This reformist spirit attracted a number of very good young physicians who wanted to make public health a career.
One of the most influential public health figures of the period is Joseph Goldberger. In 1914, he's summoned by the Surgeon General to investigate an especially baffling disease ravaging the American South. It's called pellagra. The victims develop reddish, rough skin that often appears as a butterfly-shaped rash. As the disease progresses, patients become confused, hallucinate, and finally go insane. There have been tens of thousands of deaths in the rural South by the time Joseph Goldberger is assigned the case.
At the time, it was a mystery disease, and people had many theories about what caused it. The most prominent theory was that it was caused by eating corn, and there were other people who thought that it must be carried by an insect. This was fairly early on in the bacteriological revolution, and so some people thought that it was carried by a bacteria. But no one knew what caused it, and there was great panic.
Goldberger journeys through the South to observe firsthand the conditions where pellagra is most severe. Everywhere he travels, the picture is strikingly similar. Desperately poor people working in cotton fields and textile mills, suffering from the disease. Goldberger visits insane asylums and other state institutions where alarming numbers of new cases are being reported. He knows the disease causes insanity, which might account for the victims in asylums. But why is it so prevalent in orphanages and prisons? And if it's an infectious disease, why isn't the staff getting sick as well?
One would think that if this were a germ disease, the germs certainly wouldn't be aware of status boundaries. Why would only the inmates get pellagra, and why never a nurse, a physician, or a teacher?
And he began to look at what people ate, and he was horrified at what he saw because the diet was so miserable, not like anything he had ever seen before. It was the diet of the southern frontier, consisting primarily of cornbread, fatback or pork, and syrup.
And so increasingly, as he went from institution to institution observing, Goldberger became convinced that he was dealing with some sort of nutritional issue, but not a germ disease.
Goldberger is well aware of the recent discoveries of chemical elements in food called vitamins. He also knows that diseases like scurvy and beriberi have been linked to vitamin deficiencies. And he suspects pellagra may be the same kind of disease. Goldberger decides to test his theory at 2 orphanages full of pellagra victims in Jackson, Mississippi. He starts by improving the children's meager diet with fresh vegetables, meat, and milk, foods rich in vitamins and proteins.
And lo and behold, much to his own delight, the children who had pellagra got well when their diets were changed, and those who didn't have pellagra didn't contract pellagra after their diets were changed. Well, that was all well and good, but it certainly wasn't scientific evidence, and Goldberger was very much aware of that.
Goldberger publishes his diet theory anyway. If he's right, lives will be saved, and if he's wrong, better food certainly won't harm anyone. But to his dismay, few take his theory seriously.
A lot of people didn't believe Dr. Goldberger's theory because the medical profession was just getting used to the bacteriological revolution. and they could not believe that they had something else that they had to master. They could not get used to the fact that a disease could be caused by the lack of something. It's like proving a negative, and they just couldn't cope with that. Some of them may have taken offense also at the fact that his criticism of the diet implied a criticism of the Southern way of life.
Goldberger decides to show Southerners that he can actually give people pellagra by simply changing their diet. He persuades the governor of Mississippi to pardon any convicts who volunteer for a controlled diet experiment. He chooses the Rankin prison farm because there are no cases of pellagra and plenty of room to isolate the convicts from germs. The volunteers, whose offenses range from embezzlement to murder, are dubbed the Pellagra Squad.
They were moved to a special building that had screens on the windows so that no insects could come in. It was scrubbed once a week very carefully. They wore clean clothes every day. The only thing that was different about their lives, other than that, was the food that they ate.
Instead of eating the vegetables from the prison garden, what they're now going to be eating is what other impoverished Southerners eat. Cornbread, cornmeal, corn mush, occasionally some pork. In short, he's going to switch their diet in such a way that it will be the diet that he has observed pellagra victims eating.
At first, the men treat the experiment as a lark. It all seems so easy. But 3 weeks in, they start complaining to Goldberger. They are nauseated. They suffer pains in their backs and sides. They become moody, confused, and exhausted. 2 men beg to be released, saying they would prefer a lifetime of hard labor to another week of this hellish experiment. 6 months later, 7 of the 11 prisoners break out with the characteristic pellagra rash.
Goldberger is thrilled. He has succeeded at what he wants to do, and he expects everyone not only to applaud his efforts, but to accept his understanding of pellagra, that this is a dietary disorder and not a germ disease.
Goldberger tells the pardoned men which foods they should eat to cure their pellagra, and then waits for public acknowledgement of his breakthrough. But acceptance doesn't come. Some Southerners even accuse him of perpetrating a hoax. When he links pellagra to jobs that don't pay enough for people to eat well, Southerners hear only his social criticism, not his medical reasoning. Goldberger, the scientist, is stunned by what he sees as total irrationality.
The Goldberger story shows you that science by itself is not enough, that people have to change their behavior, people have to believe what the scientists are telling them, and only then will they actually act upon the knowledge that someone like Goldberger provides.
Goldberger returns to the lab and dedicates the rest of his life to finding the specific cause of a disease he already knows how to prevent and cure. He hasn't found the answer when death comes at the age of 53 from another mystery disease, cancer.
He died a disappointed man because pellagra was more prevalent in 1929 than it had been in years, and he thought that he was a failure.
8 years after Goldberger's death, scientists finally discover that niacin, a B-complex vitamin, can prevent the disease. It's soon added to common foods. Today, there are no more cases of pellagra in the United States. And hardly anyone knows this terrible disease ever existed. By 1920, there has been a revolution in public health. We have strategies that can help to prevent infectious diseases. And we understand that better food, cleaner water, and improved sanitation can lead to a longer and healthier life. Of course, people still get sick a lot, and when they do, they have mostly these to turn to. Here is Cooper's new discovery for indigestion, rheumatism, for blood disease, fever and chills, male and female problems. And if that isn't enough, it also removes worms. The busy Cooper Medical Company also offers Cooper's Quick Relief, which claims to cure everything from toothache to cholera. And let's not forget glycoheroin for coughs. 1/2 grain of pure heroin in every fluid ounce. But there are signs that things are about to change. Using X-rays and laboratory tests, science is carefully studying the body now. We're beginning to understand our internal organs, our glands, and the messengers called hormones that regulate so much of our inner chemistry. But how we can use this knowledge to help those whose bodies have broken down, that's another matter entirely. And as always, time is running short. Of all the ways our bodies can betray us, few are as terrifying as diabetes. The disease strikes some when they are young, others when they grow old. All who suffer are consumed with a terrible hunger and thirst, but no amount of food or drink will help. The diabetic's body cannot absorb what it takes in. Slowly, the victim slips into a deadly coma that doctors are powerless to halt. No one can explain this breakdown of the body's internal chemistry, but it's reasoned that if diabetics cannot tolerate food, perhaps they can survive by eating less. The leading proponent of this theory is Dr. Frederick Allen, an uncompromising man who demands that his patients lose at least 30% of their body weight.
Dr. Allen's undernutrition approach, promptly dubbed the starvation approach to diabetes, led to a ghastly kind of therapy in which people who were already complaining that they couldn't get enough food and drink had to do with less, and in fact had to gradually starve to death. And there are terrible stories of diabetic patients stealing hot food from ovens, burning their hands to do it, eating toothpaste and birdseed left in their rooms. But if you starved yourself carefully, you could buy another year or two of life. But it was not a very satisfactory life.
Only the strong-willed can survive the Allen diet. Elizabeth Hughes, the 11-year-old daughter of a Supreme Court justice, has already lost 20 pounds. Barely clinging to life, Elizabeth and her parents can only pray for a scientific breakthrough to save her. A glimmer of hope comes when researchers discover that a gland in the abdomen called the pancreas plays an important role in the disease. The gland appears to have two major functions. It produces enzymes that travel through ducts and into the small intestine to help in the digestion of food. And it produces another, internal secretion. That is absorbed into the bloodstream to help regulate the metabolism of sugars and other carbohydrates. Because diabetics have a high level of sugar in their blood, scientists wonder if their disease is being triggered by the gland's failure to produce this internal secretion. Almost immediately, attempts are made to isolate this substance in hopes of curing the disease. But by 1920, no one has succeeded. Then a young Canadian surgeon named Frederick Banting stumbles across an article about the relationship between diabetes and the pancreas, which gives him an idea. He goes to Toronto University and meets with an internationally known expert on the metabolism of carbohydrates. J.J. McLeod. Although Banting has no background for this type of research, he proposes a new approach to the problem. Banting's idea is to tie off the pancreatic ducts leading to the small intestines, so the cells making the digestive juices will atrophy and die. Then, only the pancreas's internal secretion will be actively produced, making it easier to isolate. Intrigued, McLeod agrees to give Banting 10 dogs to experiment on, a tiny lab, the services of a research assistant, Charles Best, and a few months to work on the problem. The eager young scientists begin operating on the dogs with disastrous results.
You have to imagine working in a laboratory in sweltering weather without air conditioning. Imagine a couple of enthusiastic young researchers trying to operate on dogs, the sweat pouring off their bodies, dripping into the wounds of the dogs becoming infected and dying at a faster rate than they ever dreamed of. Banting and Best being so worried that they were killing so many dogs that they went out on the streets of Toronto and bought extra dogs and slipped them into the lab surreptitiously. Almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. There were times when they were ready to quit.
Finally, after weeks of fumbling, Banting and Best manage to make an extract they hope will contain the internal secretion. They inject it into the dogs, whose pancreases have been removed and who are now severely diabetic. It will be hours before the researchers will know if the injection has lowered the dog's high level of blood sugar. When they measure the level again, it's gone down dramatically. A sign that the extract is working. The pair is convinced it's a breakthrough. An ecstatic Banting awaits McLeod's return from his summer holiday to share the results and ask for additional support.
He wanted better facilities. He wanted more dogs, more assistants. He also wanted some money because he was working for nothing and was broke. Wanted his research to have the highest priority in J.J.R. McLeod's lab. McLeod was not prepared to do this because the results were not yet at anything like that level of credibility. So Banting and McLeod at the end of the summer of 1921 had a terrible confrontation with Banting finally saying to McLeod, "Dr. McLeod, we will see if the University of Toronto appreciates the importance of my research." McLeod saying, "Dr. Banting, as far as you are concerned, I am the University of Toronto." Best remembered Banting coming out of the meeting practically frothing at the mouth, saying, "I'll show the little son of a bitch that he is not the University of Toronto."
McLeod wants to know how long a diabetic dog can survive on Banting's extract, to see if it's effective over time. But to carry out the new experiment, Banting and Best will need far more of the internal secretion than they presently have. In a desperate move, Banting grinds up pancreases obtained from the local slaughterhouse and tries to isolate the internal secretion by cooling and separating it with alcohol solvents. Surprisingly, this simple method gives him the supply of extracts he needs. The exhausting months of tying off pancreatic ducts had been totally unnecessary. The researchers are now ready to begin the longevity experiment with diabetic dog 27 and dog 33. Both animals are given 2 daily injections. 11 days later, dog 27 goes into shock and dies. Instead of prolonging the dog's life, the extract has mysteriously killed it. But dog 33 is alive and well even after 70 days of injections. Theorizing that dog 27 was killed by impure extract, McLeod suggests bringing biochemist J.B. Collop onto the team. The experienced Collop quickly improves the quality of the extract. He writes in his diary, "We have obtained from the pancreas of animals a mysterious something which, when injected into totally diabetic dogs, completely removes all the cardinal symptoms of the disease. If the substance works on humans, it will be a great boon to medicine." Collop's mysterious something is the internal secretion of the pancreas, a hormone that the team names insulin. On January 11th, without Collop's knowledge, Banting prepares his own version of the extract. It will be given to a 14-year-old diabetic boy named Leonard Thompson. Banting hopes the injection will lower the boy's high level of blood sugar. But when it fails to work and causes a reaction, the experiment is halted.
What a discouragement. What a discouragement. The extract had always been loaded with toxic contaminants. And even on the dogs, the effect had been very erratic. Sometimes you had good stuff, sometimes it didn't work. It was just so full of impurities that it was really a kind of hit and miss scattergun approach, maybe hitting a few more times than missing, but in fact it missed in the first clinical test.
On January 23rd, Leonard Thompson is given a new extract, prepared by Collop. This time it works. The boy becomes more alert, looks better, and says he feels stronger. It's the first successful use of insulin on a human diabetic.
Amazingly, sadly, the great breakthrough on Leonard Thompson was followed by the utter breakdown of relations of the research team, as Collop went to Banting and Best in the lab and said, "I've done it, I know how to do it." Banting said, "How did you do it?" Collop said, "I'm not going to tell you." Whereupon Banting grabbed Collop and tried to throttle him. It was close to a fist fight in the lab. How could this happen? How could researchers on the brink of a great discovery like this, a discovery that really is of global importance, how could they turn into wrestling children? Somebody had talked about patenting the discovery. And as often in science, teamwork, cooperation is all very good until immortality, glory, and dollars start to intrude.
After the breakthrough with Leonard Thompson, Collop is put in charge of making the extract in larger quantities. But this time, his new methods fail. He goes back to his old laboratory procedures, and they don't work either. He had blended and filtered, concentrated and diluted, distilled and evaporated, never making the same batch of extract twice. And now, he has trouble recalling what he has done. As the first store of insulin runs out, the team is besieged by dying patients. They put aside their differences and work together in the lab. 3 months and countless combinations later, they regain the ability to make insulin, but still only in small quantities. Desperate for help, they forge an alliance with Eli Lilly, a large American pharmaceutical firm. Lilly's chemists soon solved the problems of mass production. Finally, there is enough insulin for everyone. The impact on diabetics is immediate and extraordinary. One doctor, stunned by the resurrection of his patients, evokes the biblical story of Ezekiel. I will bring flesh upon you, put breath in you, and you shall live. He calls it Banting's chapter of the Bible. The first child Banting brings back from a deadly coma is Elsie Needham. 4 months later, she seems like a healthy, normal girl with years of life ahead of her. Yet of all Banting's grateful patients, his most memorable is Elizabeth Hughes, who had barely clung to life. You'd think it was a fairy tale, she writes her mother. I look entirely different, gaining every hour in strength and weight. Oh, it is simply too wonderful for words. In Boston, Dr. Elliot Jocelyn is one of the first American specialists to be supplied with insulin. He endorses it as one of the greatest discoveries of the century, the beginning of a new epoch in medicine. But eventually, he and his staff realized that the drug is not as miraculous as they had hoped.
In the beginning, after the discovery of insulin, its use was widely misunderstood. Everyone thought this was a cure, and why not? Of course, what was not known was that people were alive, but not necessarily cured. It was not until, the 1940s, there was a great age of disillusionment, because they then discovered that although the people lived, and lived really normal lives, they were developing eye complications, kidney complications, nerve complications. Simply to give insulin was not good enough. It had to be precisely the right amount, such as your body does in normal circumstances.
Jocelyn is among the first to realize that insulin has transformed diabetes from a fatal disease to a chronic one. He warns that the era of coma and death has given way to the era of complications. He teaches his patients that the disease can only be held at bay by strict diet, constant testing, and a rigid schedule of injections. But there's no mistaking the elation that although diabetes cannot be cured, it can at least be tamed.
The effect of insulin was to show in a very dramatic way that doctors really could be effective, that they could treat a dreadful disease in a relatively simple and inexpensive way, and that science now really made a difference. And this gave not just doctors more confidence in what they were doing, but it gave patients a greater confidence in what medicine could do for them. And it immeasurably boosted the image of medicine in the eyes of the public.
By now, when a doctor comes to your house, yes, there are such things as house calls, he comes with a few real remedies in his leather case. Besides insulin for diabetics, he has aspirin for aches, pains, and fever, digitalis for bad heart. And for infectious disease, he at least has a vaccine that can prevent smallpox. Now, a vaccine does not cure you of anything. It actually gives you a weakened dose of a disease. But your body is now able to protect you against the real illness should you come in contact with it later on. But the elusive prize for medical science is to find something that can cure people after they've gotten sick. Since the days of Pasteur, researchers have searched for substances that could kill bacteria, the germs that cause infections ranging from pneumonia to blood poisoning, all of which can be life-threatening. But no one has found this magic medicine, even after decades of trying. One laboratory scientist searching for weapons against bacteria is British researcher Alexander Fleming. He's just beginning his career when the outbreak of war allows him to observe firsthand severely infected wounds.
When the First World War broke out, Alexander Fleming, like many other physicians, found himself over in Northern Europe treating battlefield casualties. The fields in Northern Europe, in Belgium, Flanders, these were richly fertilized fields. And richly fertilized fields are rich in microorganisms which, when they come in contact with exposed wounds, cause deadly infections. It's said that probably more soldiers died from infection than died from direct bullet or shell injury.
On the battlefield, Fleming experiments with various antiseptics and even manages to save several critically wounded men. After the war, he returns to England and for the next 10 years searches diligently for compounds that can kill bacteria.
Fleming went off at the end of July every year for summer holidays in the north of Scotland, and July 1928 was no exception. He tidied up his laboratory before leaving, of course, and in doing so, he took all the plates that he'd been growing bacteria on and he stacked them in a bath of antiseptic. But there was enough antiseptic in that bath to cover all the plates. Fortunately, one or two remained uncovered.
What happens next is the stuff of legend, recreated in a film by Fleming himself.
Here at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington, through this very window 25 years ago, a speck of mold blew in and settled onto Professor Fleming's culture plate.
Many people will tell you that the mold came in from the street through the window of Fleming's laboratory. Fleming couldn't possibly have opened his window because he had a whole bench full of laboratory glassware and petri dishes in front of him, and he couldn't have stretched over to open the window. No truth in that story. The mold, almost certainly, came from the laboratory below his, where a researcher was working with fungi. And that mold landed on the dish at the top of the stack and started to grow.
Weeks later, Fleming discovers what luck and a little sloppiness can produce.
Professor Fleming was examining colonies of bacteria when he came upon one which had gone mouldy. Round the mould, the jelly was clear, as if the mould were preventing the bacteria from growing.
Now, when Fleming picked up this plate and looked at it, his first reaction probably was to say, it's contaminated, and throw it away. But he thought twice, and he realized he had the sagacity to understand what was happening.
Fleming immediately sets out to confirm his suspicion that a substance in the mold has killed the bacteria. He calls his new discovery penicillin, after the mold Penicillium. He observes that the mold can destroy the cell walls of the most virulent strains of bacteria. And when he mixes penicillin with his own blood, he's delighted to see that while it's lethal to bacteria, it's quite harmless to human blood cells. But Fleming has difficulty extracting penicillin from the mold. He manages to recover just enough to test on the kind of surface wound infections he saw during the war.
The penicillin mold that he'd grown in the broth in the laboratory didn't produce enough penicillin to cure infections by applying it topically. It was fine to kill off bacteria growing on a plate of agar. You didn't need much penicillin to do that. But to work in an open wound needed a fairly high concentration of penicillin. Fleming was never able to achieve that. So when he found that his penicillin wasn't working, he lost interest in it.
On May 29, 1929, Fleming publishes the results of his work in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. He matter-of-factly describes a substance that demonstrates some antibacterial properties. And perhaps thinking he would return to penicillin one day, he carefully preserves the fickle mold and moves on to other research. In 1929, Alexander Fleming doesn't realize what he's found. Four years later, German chemist Gerhard Domack discovers a sulfa drug that prevents bacteria from multiplying, giving the body's own defenses a chance to destroy them. When World War II breaks out, soldiers on both sides are given sulfa powder to carry into battle. If injured, they're told to sprinkle it directly on the wound to thwart the growth of bacteria. But sulfa proves ineffective against a number of infections and sometimes causes severe reactions. The quest continues for an even better antibiotic drug. The man who will take up the challenge is Howard Florey, chairman of the pathology department at Oxford University. Florey hires a biochemist, Ernst Chain, who has recently fled from Nazi Germany. They begin exploring natural substances that can kill bacteria when they chance upon Fleming's 10-year-old article on penicillin. Amazingly, a sample of Fleming's mold has been kept alive. Within months, they extract enough of the crude drug to conduct a few small experiments. On May 25th, 1940, while Britain prepares for another night of air raids, the Oxford team attempts the experiment Fleming never tried. They inject a group of mice with a fatal dose of Streptococcus bacteria. An hour later, Florey treats half the group with penicillin. Norman Heatley is left to watch over the progress of the mice.
The mice who hadn't had penicillin started looking very sick after about 6 or 7 hours. And by 16 and a half hours, the control mice were all dead, the ones that hadn't had it. But the ones that had had penicillin were behaving just normally. They would run around for a bit, they'd sleep for a bit, and if you clicked your fingers, they'd wake up.
The researchers involved certainly had a strong feeling that they were on the brink of something major. The team actually took some of the spores of the penicillium and rubbed it into their clothing under the lapels of their jacket, so that if Britain was invaded, they could flee perhaps to America or somewhere else where they could begin the research all over again. The people working with the penicillin at Oxford certainly had tremendous faith in it.
But the real test of the drug's effectiveness will have to be made on human subjects. And this will require 3,000 times the amount of penicillin given to a mouse. Desperate for help, Florey tries to persuade British pharmaceutical firms to The Pan American Exposition of 1901 is a celebration of America and the promise of a new century. Elaborately staged in Buffalo, New York, the fair is an entertaining showcase of culture and industry. The centerpiece is a 409-foot electric tower studded with 35,000 incandescent light bulbs. It proclaims a new age of progress. Even President McKinley is here to speak of a bright future to his rapt audience, until tragedy strikes. The bewildered president has been struck by an assassin's bullet. He's rushed to the exposition's infirmary, where the doctors decide they must operate immediately. They scrub their hands and instruments, but as in the custom of the day, they wear no gloves, caps, or masks to help ward off infection. Ether is used to render the president unconscious. But ether is highly flammable, so the outdated gas lights must be turned off. At 5:29 p.m., the operation begins. As the daylight fades, a doctor uses a mirror to guide the last rays of sunlight into the darkening room. They hunt in vain for the bullet in McKinley's abdomen. After an hour and 20 minutes of cutting and probing, they close the wound. The bullet is never found. Outside, anxious crowds wait for any news of the operation. They are told the president is alive and being given raw eggs to sustain him, enemas to purge him, and injections of strychnine to stimulate his nerves. But 8 days later, William McKinley dies from gangrene, a bacterial infection caused by his wound. It is an ominous beginning for medicine in the 20th century. In 1900, the era of scientific medicine is only just beginning. There are few first-rate physicians, almost no medicines. If you become sick or injured, you'll need a strong constitution or plenty of luck to survive, even if you are President of the United States. It's been a few decades since the French scientist Louis Pasteur discovered the microscopic creatures we call bacteria and demonstrated that these germs could cause many illnesses. Later, researchers discover an even tinier infectious agent, the virus. But despite these discoveries, many people continue to blame sickness on a variety of human traits and social conditions. A poor constitution, a degenerate lifestyle, or miasmic clouds of filth emanating from the city slums. Though the scientific community knows that germs cause disease, they don't completely understand how they're spread. And they certainly don't know how to destroy them. In the early morning hours of June 27th, 1899, a ship sails into San Francisco Bay, ending a fateful voyage from Hong Kong. At the U.S. quarantine station on Angel Island, a delegation of health officials anxiously awaits the ship's arrival. 2 passengers aboard may have died from the dreaded bubonic plague. If it's true, the ship cannot be allowed to reach the mainland. Angel Island is San Francisco's bastion of defense against infectious diseases. All immigrants must first pass through these hallways to be examined and disinfected. Anyone who shows signs of illness could be quarantined or sent back home. Lately, health inspectors have been especially worried that foreigners might bring in the plague, an ancient and deadly bacterial infection that rapidly overwhelms the body's defenses.
There was a great deal of fear and anticipation in San Francisco that the plague was coming to invade the West Coast. In fact, the plague had already begun in China 30 years earlier and had moved down the coast to cities like Canton and Hong Kong, with which we had a great deal of commercial traffic as well as immigration traffic.
There are hundreds of thousands of victims in China and India. Japan, the Philippines, and Hawaii have also been struck. When the plague breaks out in the Chinese quarter of Honolulu, panicked officials accidentally burn the neighborhood to the ground. 500 years after the plague wiped out a third of Europe in the Middle Ages, there is still no cure. And now the disease may have finally reached America. At Angel Island, the ship is quarantined by the U.S. government's top bacteriologist, Joseph Kenyon. Assuming that plague bacteria is spread person to person, Kenyon quarantines the mostly Asian passengers and crew. Like his colleagues, he also believes plague bacteria thrive in dirt and can be spread to human dwellings by vermin. So he orders the ship fumigated with steam and poisonous sulfuric sprays. As officers inspect the cargo, stowaways are suddenly discovered. 2 appear to have the plague. Fearing imprisonment, the ill stowaways escape during the night and try to swim to San Francisco. Early the next morning, their corpses are found floating in the harbor. When local officials announce that they do have the plague, the city feels more vulnerable than ever. On March 6, 1900, the Chinese Year of the Rat, the body of Chick Jin, a Chinese merchant, is found in the basement of a cheap hotel. An autopsy confirms everyone's worst fears. The plague has struck in Chinatown. Accusing the Chinese of being foul spreaders of disease, the city jumps into action. Police